What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Good With Project. I'm your host, Jerry Scarlato, and today we have a Lessons from History episode. We'll be talking about the discrimination of women and blacks, because that is still a huge topic today. I'll go ahead and throw this caveat out there that discrimination has certainly historically been a thing. We're going to be focusing primarily on modern history after the 1900s or so. But of course, discrimination has been a thing in history, even in modern history. Of course, it has been less against women than against blacks and other minorities, which we'll see in a little bit. But discrimination has been a thing in history. And I am sorry to say that it will continue to be a thing, not a pervasive thing, not as much as the political left-leaning people would like us to believe how pervasive that it is today. It is not as pervasive as we are brought to believe that it is today. It is much less pervasive. We have made lots of progress when it comes to discrimination against any person. And in fact, we have gone into reverse discrimination, quote unquote, working against, especially me or people like me. I am a white man. And as a wonderful, very kind white woman TikToker once told me, it's easy for you white guys to say things like that. So I laugh anytime I think about that comment. Anyway, discrimination will always be a thing. And I only say that not to say that, oh, we should just give up and pretend like, everything's going to continue, like discrimination is always going to be there. By no means is that the case. We should always strive to improve. And the huge gains that we have made in equality of opportunity it's absolutely phenomenal for any race, for any gender, male or female, since those are the genders available to us. For anybody, we have made gigantic strides. Are things, I really hate the word equal, so I hate to say it like that. Are we as good as we could be? No, we can, of course, continue to make progress as a society, as a whole. But the reason that I say discrimination will always be there is because you cannot control every single individual. It just can't happen. Where I would argue that some, again, the left-leaning, politically left-leaning people, especially on the further ends, would like to try to do that, and I think are trying to do that. But nonetheless, you cannot control every human being. It just can't be done. And so human beings, being that they are individuals, being that they will make their own damn decisions, being that they will do what they want to do, when it comes down to it, human beings will discriminate. And to an extent, all human beings do discriminate, whether you like it or you think that you do or not. All human beings do. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're discriminating against another race, but you may discriminate against a type of person, no matter what that race is. You may discriminate against lower income people or higher income people. Higher income people, a lot of people discriminate against them right now. That is discrimination in some way, shape, or form. What we're going to be talking about today is mostly societal and financial discrimination. So it's when we're talking about discriminating against higher income people, clearly their finances are just fine and they're not worried about that necessarily. But when it comes to discrimination in general, do not be a fucking hypocrite, and please recognize that we're all discriminating in some way, shape, or form. And yes, of course, we can all do better. And as a society, we can continue to improve and do better. So today we'll be talking about the major arguments when it comes to discrimination between or against women and blacks. And the reason that we're talking about blacks and not all minorities is because if we lumped all minorities together, then it would be a different, we'd be having a different conversation. And that's because some minorities are on the upper end of the economic scale and some minorities are on the lower end of the economic scale. And then, of course, we have everywhere in between. So the average would become the average. There would not be as much of an argument. And when it comes to just discrimination against blacks in general, of course, that's where the argument has been since the abolishment of slavery, and since the Civil Rights Act, and affirmative action, and all that fun stuff. So, as we'll see, those things didn't have quite the outcome that that society, or I'll say the government, hoped that they would have. But nonetheless, that's what we're going to be focusing on. So we're going to start with women and the major arguments when it comes to discrimination against women. Now, the major arguments are twofold. Number one is that women get paid less than men. Number two is that women get passed over on jobs more than or over men. So men get hired and get promoted more often than women do. So I'll go ahead and tell you that women do get hired and promoted more often than women do. And men on average do get paid more than women do. And when I tell you that, you go, see, you just proved yourself that that's the case. But there is a big problem with just what I said. And that's what you hear. What I just said is what you hear. And that's true. But not all statistics are created equal. And since not all statistics are created equal, what any party will do, whether that's right, left, center, or anywhere else in between, what any party will do is use these statistics that make their argument. And one of the major things that I would say we should learn from history is that anybody is going to use the statistics that match their argument. That's what's going to happen. Today, I'm going to give you some things that I'm not necessarily making the argument that there's no discrimination against women or men, women or blacks. That's not what I'm making at all. There has been, historically, definitely, but we're in a much better place. So, but my statistics are biased to show you that the simple statement that women make less than men is not the full story. And I can't give you the full story today, but I can help you understand why that is, why women make less than men on average. I can also help you understand why men get more raises and get more promotions and get hired on average more than women. And that's what we're trying to do, is understand why that is. Because there is a simple why that is. I'll also go ahead and break the belief that if we're comparing apples to apples, and that's why those statements are such a problem, because we're not comparing apples to apples. We're making just a general judgment. Women, men, which are two very big groups that have two very potential different social things they have going on, relational things, familial things, all kinds of different potentials that they have going on in their lives. And when it comes to that, that changes potential outcomes. But when it comes to comparing the same category of women and men, meaning the same category that never married and have been in the workforce regularly, consistently, over time, full time, year round, when we compare those two, women on average get paid higher than men. And that has been the case for many years. Let me go ahead and pull out a statement so the book we're going to be using today is Economic Facts and Fallacies from Thomas Sowell. A great book. I actually used it for the previous lessons of history when I talked about the middle class, and used some of the statistics in that to help us understand how the middle class is in fact not disappearing. What has happened is people are better off. What's happening really is that the government is causing inflation, and hence where our money is not worth as much. So while people are better off, their money is not worth as much because of inflation, because of the government. So you can go ahead and look back at that lessons of history and follow that trail to understand why that is. But nonetheless, I want to quote from Thomas Sowell's book first. Let me find my page. When it comes to this equality of comparing apples to apples, not equality of, but when it comes to comparing apples to apples, in other words, comparing the same type of person to the same type of person on the opposite side. So a male who's never been married, which is important, not single, but never been married, to a female that's never been married. And I'll tell you why that's so important here in a bit. But when it comes to that, here's what Thomas says. As already noted, comparing never married women and men who are past childbearing years and who both work full-time in the 21st century shows women of this description earning more than men of the same description. So when it comes to the statement that women make less than men, if we are comparing apples to apples, that is an untrue statement. In other words, if we're comparing the same type and category of women to men, it is an untrue statement. Because women who have never been married and men who have never been married and have been in the workforce for the same amount of time, full-time, year-round, women make more than men, on average. So that's an important point to start with. That we are being told things that just aren't true, but when you clump things together, it is true. Now, the reason that that's so important is because women, of course, have different responsibilities than men and have historically. If you want to be mad at something, be mad at the family reunion. Not reunion, but the family union. Be mad at the fact that there are families. If you're a woman and you think that men make more than you and you're pissed about that, and you're pissed at businesses because of that, don't be pissed at businesses. Be pissed that the idea of the family is alive and well. Because it is simply that women tend to stay home. Women have children. Also be pissed at biology that women have children. Like if you want to be pissed about something, be pissed at evolution that women have children. Or if you're a Christian, be pissed at God or whatever. Like that's what you want to be pissed about. Because it is the fact that women have children and they go out of the workforce. And if they get back in the workforce, maybe they work part-time or they've been out of the workforce. I think the average woman, not the average woman, but it's something like 40% of women will go out of the workforce over the course of their career for like 2.5 years or something like that. So being out of the workforce for 2.5 years means that that's experience that you're losing. That's time out of the workforce. So when you go back into the workforce, guess what? If you are compared to a man or woman that has still been in the workforce and person's trying to decide on which one to hire, they're going to probably hire the person that's continued to be in the workforce. That is not fair or unfair or whatever. It is just meritocracy. It's just the way that it is. So it is literally the difference, the changes in women being hired or not being hired has to do with when they get married and when they have kids. And that even comes down to when it comes down to affirmative action. When it comes down to affirmative action, which was said in the 1970s, I don't remember exactly what year or years that went into practice. Well before affirmative action, where women was the gap between women and men closing. It was closing well before that, and also, before that, it widened back up. But the correlation was correlated on when women were getting married. If women get married earlier, let's say women get married at 25 instead of 35. If you get married earlier, that means you likely have kids earlier. That means you have to be out of the workforce earlier. So if you get in the workforce late, or you were in the workforce and then you jump out, like or maybe you stay out of the workforce completely. So the earlier women get married, the bigger the discrepancy in salaries between women and men. The later women get married, the smaller the discrepancy in salaries between women and men. And that is the correlate. The correlate is not with affirmative action. The correlate is just simply when women get married and then when women have kids. And that's why I said it's important, the statement that never married women or men are compared, because even single women means that they have been married at some point and potentially have had a kid. So their domestic duties or domestic responsibilities were different at some point. So even if they're single now and they can work full time, there was a time in which they couldn't. So their experience is still less than a man or woman who has continued to work. So here's how Thomas explains how it wasn't government intervention and affirmative action that brought equality to men and women when it comes to being in the workforce. This was already happening beforehand, and it's not comparing apples to apples that causes the difference. So Thomas says, as far back as 1969, academic women who had never married earned more than academic men who had never married, while married academic women without children earned less, and married academic women with children earned still less. So never married women earned more than men. Married women without children earned less than those women. And married women with children earn less than both of them in the same category. And that is because those women had some other responsibilities to also take care of. He continues, for women in general, that is not just academic women, those single women who had worked continuously since high school were in 1971 earning slightly more than women of the same description. All of this was before affirmative action was defined as underrepresentation in a 1971 executive order, which went into effect in 1972, and so represents what was blah, 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 blah. Later data for law school graduates in 1994 showed that men's beginning salaries averaged $48,000 and women's beginning salaries averaged $50,000 a year. So affirmative action essentially, in that essence, didn't change anything. If anything, it put more pressure on businesses to just pay people more for no particular reason. Even if they had less experience, even if they had less credentials, even if they had less knowledge, even if they had less of whatever. If anything, it put more pressure on them to just pay people more, which means on the other end of that, which we don't see and what we don't talk about, what is the net outcome of that happening? We look at it and we go, yeah, that's exactly what we want. We want affirmative action so that people get paid the same, no matter what they have done in their careers. But on the other end of that, what happens? The consumer pays more. Not because the business is greedy, but because they have to make money in order to stay in business, in order to keep giving you the thing that you want, to give you that Louis Vuitton bag. Louis Vuitton, I'm just kidding. My sister buys knockoffs from overseas, and I always joke and say, hey, you carrying your Louis Vuitton bag? Nonetheless. But if you keep wanting your Louis Vuitton bag, and you keep wanting your cars, and you keep wanting your makeup, and you keep wanting your shoes, and you keep wanting your stuff, businesses have to make money. Like, that's just what it comes down to. And so when a government regulation forces a company to pay people more for no apparent reason, then what happens? That goes to the consumer. It has to. A company can't just all of a sudden start shoveling out more money. They have to make money. So that's the big misunderstanding here, is that we're not, when it comes to the statement that men make more than women, we are not comparing the same thing. As a group, men make more than women. But when you break the group down, it is not true. Women on average work more than men. They on average, not on average, let me see. They are a bigger portion of the part-time workforce. For instance, here's what Thomas says. Part-time workers not only earn less total pay, they are also paid less per hour and are less likely to be promoted. They have been and continue to be more women than men who are part-time workers. So he doesn't give a statistic. I thought there was one, but maybe it's in a different part of the book. But he doesn't give a statistic on what that is, but it's substantially more. Like, women are substantially more, work more part-time than men do. And that's a big reason why that is because their responsibilities at home. Now, here's the irony, is that men who are married with kids are the highest earners. Okay, and people are pissed about that. Whatever. If your household is making more money, what the fuck does it matter who it's coming from? So what this really comes down to is an ego trip for the name on the check. If this is about the household and people, a family doing better, it is relatively close, and I can't remember the exact statistic, but men who are married, who have a wife who stays home and takes care of the kids, earn very similar to a couple that is married who both work, who have kids. And that's because he can put his energy into earning for the family. So when it comes down to it, what are we really after here? Since the family union has been degraded so much over the years, maybe that's not what we're after. We're just, each one of us wants to be the best and we want to all be equal and blah, 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 blah. Is that okay? Like, what are we really after here? If we want to be better and we're going to have families and we're going to be married, what does it matter who, like, if the family is better off, then the family is better off. So that's where we are when it comes to discrimination between women and men. Again, historically, discrimination between women and men has been there, and it will continue to be a thing because individuals will make their choices, and that is what it is. But we are so much better off than we used to be, and we were better off before government regulation. And government regulation, if anything, has only caused the increase of goods and services because companies have to pay more to people with less experience and less, no matter the gender or race or anything, if you got to pay more to somebody with less experience and then less knowledge and less everything, because they just happen to be in the same room as another person with more experience, that's you have to make up that difference somewhere, and that's where businesses make it up. So you can thank the government for higher prices when it comes to that. Now, let's turn our attention to the historical discrimination of blacks in America. Now, blacks have been historically much more discriminated against than women, significantly so. It is not even close. I think we can all agree on that. So that's not the question. That is the truth. The question is, today, historically, did government regulation improve or change, or was it the reason why blacks started to make a significant change in their economic outcomes as a household? Is it because of things like affirmative action and civil rights and so on and so forth that caused that? Now, of course, the abolishment of slavery was the beginning of that. That is a no-brainer. I don't think I have to make that argument. That's a no-brainer. So it had to start there. Like that had to be the beginning of it for sure, which was a necessity, and thank goodness. But nonetheless, more regulation after that. Did we see trends that were happening before that maybe we didn't have to have government regulation? And then what happened when government regulation came about? So let's take a look. So here's what Thomas has to say about Black families and household incomes before civil rights. The percentage of Black families with incomes below the poverty line fell most sharply between 1940 and 1960, going from 87% to 47% over that span. Before either the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and well before the 1970s, when affirmative action evolved into numerical goals or quotas. While the downward trend in poverty continued, the pace of that decline did not accelerate after these legal landmarks, but in fact slackened. So first, between 1940 and 1960, the number of Black families under the poverty line was nearly cut in half during those 2 decades alone. And again, that is before 1965, 1964, 1965. I think we can all do that math. And before affirmative action of the 1970s. So keep that in mind. He continues, the poverty rate declined from 47% to 30% during the decade of the 1960s, and then only from 30% to 29% between 1970 and 1980. So the Civil Rights Act civil rights came into play in 1964, I think he said, Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then Voting Rights Act of 1965, and then affirmative action of the 1970s. So in the 60s, the poverty line declined from 47% to 30%, and then only from 30% to 29% from 1970 to 1980. So from 1970 to 1980, the number of families that came out of poverty, or percentage of families that came out of poverty, Black families, 1% during the affirmative action years. Not a great number if you look at the decades from 1940 to 1960, where it was literally cut in half. You would think that there would be some substantial leap somewhere along the way. Like somehow there'd be some substantial leap. He goes on to say, the number of Blacks in white-collar occupations, managerial and administrative occupations doubled between 1940 and 1960, and nearly doubled in professional occupations. So again, during those same decades when Blacks were coming out of poverty, they were also being hired at a substantial rate, which would make perfect sense since poverty was reducing. What would have to have happened during that same time is they were going into the workforce. The median Black household income was 60.9% of the median white household income in 1970, and never rose above that or as high as that throughout the decade of 1970s. As of 1980, median Black household income was 57.6% of median white household income. I don't know what that is today. Most assuredly, it is better. Again, Blacks have been discriminated against more than women. The other thing to remember, and this is not an excuse per se, but Black families tend to be a mother and children because they have the highest rate of fatherless homes. So when you see that number, it is worth taking into consideration that many of them are single parent homes taking care of children. Again, not an excuse in the least, But what is interesting about that last statement is that, again, affirmative action takes place in the 1970s. We have Civil Rights Act in 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and then we have affirmative action. You would think that there would be some substantial increase in all of that, but actually there is a loss of household income in Black families for the decades after that time. The median Black, I'll reread that statement so that you can understand. The median Black household income was 60.9% of the median white household income in 1970. So that's after the Civil Rights Act, but before affirmative action. It never rose above that or as high as that throughout the decade of the 1970s, so during affirmative action. And as of 1980, it was 57.6%. So it was lower as of 1980, and presumably it took years to get back to at least 60.9% and then start to surpass that. So when it comes to the intervention of government in things like this, it is clear that something happens before that that is moving things along, and then the government intervenes, and then it doesn't make things any better. So what is that? You have to understand there's a big difference between a company that needs profit and a company that does not need profit. Nonprofit organizations are things like hospitals, education, public education, more specifically, universities, and the government. Those are just a few. And then for-profit are businesses, all the places that people are blaming for all of these things happening and for all these terrible stuffs and so on and so forth. But businesses have a cost to discrimination. Non-for-profits have no cost to discrimination. The government, for instance, if they discriminate against blacks, women, other minorities, the cost goes to the taxpayer. The government they don't have to worry about it. They don't care. Same thing for universities, same thing for public schools, same thing for hospitals. They have no cost to discrimination. No cost. You pay it. We don't today necessarily, because they're now on the opposite side of that, of course, but back then it wasn't the case. The biggest discriminators were government agencies and the government in general, universities, which very rarely, if ever, hired minority professors, public schools, and hospitals. They were the biggest discriminators because they have no cost of discrimination. They have no cost of it. They pay that forward to other people. A company that is for profit has a cost to discrimination, because if they discriminate against blacks, other minorities, women, whoever, if they discriminate, they are eliminating part of their workforce. It is goodbye, bye-bye. And when you eliminate part of your workforce and you narrow it down to a small group, you have to pay those people more. It is simple supply and demand. The less supply available, the higher the demand, the more you have to pay. That's the way that it is. So if you open your workforce, if you're like, hey, I'll hire anybody, you have a much higher supply. Your supply is much bigger. If you're like, no, I'm not going to discriminate against any color, any gender, it doesn't matter to me, then you have a higher supply of people available to you to hire. So there is a cost to discrimination if you are for profit. And so the simple, just a simple logical understanding of that may help you understand why it doesn't make any damn sense for a company that has to make money to survive to discriminate. But it makes sense for a company that does not have to make money to survive, and they can pull it off of somebody else. They can more likely and more easily discriminate than a company that is for profit. Another area to point out here when it comes to civil rights and blacks and equality and such is crime. So, crime is another big topic nowadays. And the assumption would be that if the government intervenes and creates civil rights and affirmative action and makes things more equal, quote unquote, gosh, I hate that word every time I say it. Nonetheless, I don't hate it because I don't believe. I believe in equal opportunity. I don't believe in whatever the definition is of equal that the politically left-leaning people are saying. I don't believe in that definition. Nonetheless, when you look at that, you would assume that that would decrease crime. Would you not? You would assume that civil rights, things are becoming more equal and things are getting better, and now we're hiring people and so on and so forth. You would assume that things would happen. What you miss is when you make people victims, they tend to act differently. They tend to change their actions. When you point out victimhood or you enhance victimhood or you exacerbate it, people will act differently. They will take that and they will sprint with it. They will run with it. And here's what happened after civil rights. Crime among black Americans, like crime among white Americans, was declining for years prior to the decade of the 1960s, with its landmark civil rights laws and its, quote, war on poverty programs. But it was during the 1960s that crime rates began skyrocketing among blacks and whites, and it was precisely after the historic civil rights laws were passed that blacks began rioting in cities across the country. Within days of the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the first of hundreds of riots that would rack cities across the country over the next 4 years began in the black neighborhood of Los Angeles, known as Watts. He goes on, nationally, the most and worst urban ghetto riots occurred during the Johnson administration, but there was not one major urban riot during the entire 8 years of the Reagan administration. So Lyndon Baines Johnson, he became president after JFK was assassinated. So he had 2 years there, and then he was elected again after that. So he was in for 6 years, I believe. And then Ronald Reagan was in for 8 years. He had 2 terms. Ronald Reagan, no riots. Lyndon Baines Johnson, who put all of these things into play. Medicare, Medicaid into play, Civil Rights Act of 1964, Voting Rights Act, not affirmative action, I'm sorry. But nonetheless, put all of these things into play. That's when riots started happening. So when you exacerbate victimhood, or you make people victims, I'll put it that way, because that's what was happening. The gap was closing on its own. Like it was closing. It was closing. Crime was coming down. The poverty was coming down. The differences in income the gap was closing on its own. The market adjusted on its own. It started to happen, and it was happening quickly. And then government intervention happened. And we look at that, we're like, well, civil rights it was a good thing. And of course, again, equality of opportunity. Yes, most definitely. I don't give a damn what color you are. I don't give a damn what gender you are. I don't give a damn about any of that. Does not mean anything to me. Should not mean anything to you. And so, if that is the case, how do we not understand that when government intervention comes into play is when things go wrong? As soon as Lyndon Baines Johnson went and started telling people how much they were victims and created victims, what happened? Riots happened. Crime went back up. I don't call that productive. But guess what? The government is a non-for-profit organization, and they make their money from you. They make their money from you. So, if they do that and things happen, they can point at, first of all, they can point at other things. And that's why businesses have been the scapegoat for all of this, which in fact, it has been the opposite. I just gave you a couple of examples on how that has happened. It has been the opposite. Up until 1965 and affirmative action in the 1970s, it was the government and other non-for-profits that discriminated most. Not only, but most. Didn't make sense for a for-profit company to discriminate because now they can hire everybody. They have lots of people to choose from. And if they did discriminate, then it's likely people would not buy from them. People of whatever group they were discriminating from. So they also then eliminated that group. That becomes a problem when it comes to a for-profit company, but for a not-for-profit company, they don't give a shit. They don't care. That's why understanding this stuff is so important. That's why looking at history and pulling things apart is so important. When somebody uses a statistic in such a way that it seems you're like, man, it's very drastic. Like if you looked at the number between men and women and the salary difference, I'm sure it would be drastic. If you just took a number, the average, just women as a group, men as a group, and took that average, I'm sure it would be a drastic difference. I don't know what it is, but I'm sure it would look significant. And of course that would piss people off. But you got to be able to pull things apart. When it seems so drastic, you got to go, there's something back there that is different. And no matter the political leaning, no matter the point, no matter nothing, no matter where you stand on the continuum, people will use the statistics that make their argument. It's the way that it is. I wouldn't say that I'm any different, and I wouldn't say that you are any different. And yet the goal is to try and use, to the extent, the goal is to be able to find the closest truth possible. And not to manipulate the statistics to fit your truth. I'll use statistics to make my point, of course. But if it just so happens that those statistics are also the majority of the truth, and yes, there are statistics that show otherwise, but the major part of the statistics show this point that I'm making, that means that is the case. We have found the truth, or we have gotten closer to the truth. And that's the point of it. It's to get closer to understanding, to get closer to the truth, to help us learn so that we can make different decisions today so that we can then have a better future. Because thus far, or at least in the recent past, after I would argue World War II especially, I've already shown you a couple of examples of that, but after World War II especially, we have been, and this is another word I don't like, but it's the one that popped into my head, we have been gaslighted when it comes to these statistics and these ideas on how they have worked. Many of them have not worked well. Most of them have not worked at all and have done the opposite of what they were intended to do. Generally speaking, if you look at a law or a bill, it generally will end up doing the opposite of what it says it's going to do. That's the way that it has been when it comes to government intervention. That doesn't, and I'm not advocating, this is not a right-left, it's just it's a general blanket statement, if I'm being honest. So that's why personal responsibility is also very important. That's why I'm a huge advocate for you quitting your job and finding a company to buy or a company to start, which you could do. It is not that hard. It is not that challenging, and you could easily bypass your income and overcome the healthcare benefits and blah, 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 blah. All of those lies that companies sell you. I'll do an episode on that down the road. Nonetheless, that's why I'm an advocate of that. So that's our lesson for today. Make sure that you share this with somebody else who could use a little lesson from history today as well. And until next time, here's to your 1% growth every day.